Hello and welcome to another episode of the MIDDVantage series exploring careers in global security. In this episode, we're talking nuclear disarmament. My name is Eleanor Krabill and I'm a master's candidate and member of the Middlebury Institute, class of 2021. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce you to Gaukhar Mukhatzhanova, Director of the International Organizations and Non-Proliferation Program at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. Gaukhar graduated from the then Monterey Institute in 2007 and has since served as an expert advisor to the Kazakh and Chilean delegations at the 2010 and 2015 NPT review conferences, and advised the Chilean delegation at the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017. Thank you so much for joining us, Gaukhar.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
To start today's episode and ease us into the disarmament conversation, I thought we could start with a little bit of background on you. So would you mind telling us a bit about how you came into the field and perhaps an exciting thing that you've learned as a practitioner that you wish people knew about disarmament and the disarmament community writ large?
What brought me to the field, I think, was a combination of some interest and a lot of luck. After graduating college, I worked in Kazakhstan and worked for the UN development program there. And so I became interested in international relations issues and decided to pursue a master's degree in international studies. And because of that background, focusing mostly on development issues as I was looking for schools and programs. But it so happened that a good friend and colleague at the UN was a Monterey graduate with specialization in non-proliferation. And so she persuaded me to try out Monterey Institute. And that's the path that really worked out the best. I was accepted. I was offered a scholarship to study non-proliferation. And I've never really looked back. It was a steep learning curve. I came in as an absolute beginner with really no background in nuclear issues at all. But I think it's really proved worth it. And what I certainly did not know going in, and probably most people wouldn't know, is that the field is small enough that fairly soon after you enter it, you can end up not only meeting, but actually working with various experts that seem like gods, when you just start out. You read articles and books by Scott Sagan or Cohen or others. And a couple of years later, one of them is your colleague. You cooperate with another on a book project, or you just really meet them at conferences, and you talk to people, and it's really exciting how close you can get to experts, how soon it can happen.
For a little bit further context, would you mind talking a little bit about what you see as the central issues faced by the disarmament community at present?
Well, this has been interesting time in many respects, and I think in terms of the value of nuclear weapons, the sort of discourse around the role of nuclear weapons and in the pursuit of nuclear disarmament, what we've seen in the past decade or so is a growing divergence of two trends, and because on the one hand, we've had a severe worsening of relations between Russia and the United States and the West writ large. And that has affected the security situation and threat perceptions, especially among the European states. So in a sense, we've seen a certain recommitment to nuclear weapons as the source of security, recommitment to their role, the sort of value of the US extended nuclear deterrence. And what we've heard a lot from the United States and others is that the conditions are just not right for nuclear disarmament, for any kind of rapid progress on nuclear disarmament. On the other hand, we've seen a trend developing among the majority of non-nuclear weapon states of not only becoming tired with a situation where there's not enough progress on nuclear disarmament, but also drawing inspiration from the success of humanitarian disarmament processes in other spheres, like the mine ban or the cluster munitions ban. And so that converged into empowerment of kind among non-nuclear states and the growth of what is known as the humanitarian initiative, reminder of what it is that nuclear weapons do as a motivator for a more rapid, more urgent progress for nuclear disarmament. And so we've seen the emergence of understanding that the impact of nuclear weapons is so inhumane, so devastating, that those are not legitimate weapons. Those should not be legitimate instruments of security and therefore should be prohibited, just like other weapons of mass destruction. And that ultimately gave us the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And these two trends are very hard to reconcile, where on the one hand, there's a commitment that we still need nuclear weapons for security because the situation is so volatile. And on the other hand, there's a trend that says, no, these weapons are not an answer to security concerns. They are inhumane. They should be prohibited. So the big challenge we're facing now is how do we reconcile the two, and how do we move the regime forward and next steps on nuclear disarmament.
I think touching on the non-proliferation policy crisis, the disarmament policy crisis that you mentioned, is an important thing to discuss. In the US, we have a tendency to point to it as being a product of the last 4 years, but it is a product of the last decade or more. With this as context, do you anticipate our disarmament policy crisis lasting much longer? And how do you think we will emerge from this crisis? What consequences are we going to have to grapple with, and how will we approach these crises? How should we be approaching these crises?
Yeah, so in the past at least 4 years, there's been a lot of talk, obviously, about the crisis in arms control and the crumbling of the arms control architecture that took decades to build. And as evidence of that, of course, we'd look at the demise of the IMF treaty, the Intermediate Range Forces Treaty, the withdrawal of the United States from the Open Skies Treaty. So this all is pointing to this building that took so long to construct, sort of crumbling with nothing coming to replace it. But as you pointed out, it's not something that just came about during the previous US administration. I think it was kind of a culmination of a trend that had been in the making before. And it was brought about by, I think, a variety of factors, one of which is the changing perception of security and strategic stability, what constitutes strategic weapons, and what constitutes key threats by the main actors involved. And the change in Russian behavior, I think, was very important, but also, of course, the United States. Domestic politics have played a part in both. I think the United States, in particular, we saw that arms control issues became subject to partisanship in a way that they hadn't been for decades before. And so I think that's added the difficulty to any U.S. administration's ability to negotiate a new arms control agreement or to maintain and keep an arms control agreement. So it is certainly a crisis, but it's not only due to one particular politician. It's a product of different developments, and therefore it's just a change in the U.S. administration, while bringing a very hopeful new trend in their approach, is not enough in and of itself to cure this, right? It's not. I wish it were that simple, but it's not. We won't see an overnight sort of reassessment of the situation and return to all the arms control agreements and practices. And so now that there is a sort of different approach from the US side, at least, hopefully we can have a re-engagement in arms control, substantive arms control dialogue between the United States and Russia, where they would have to find a way to address those questions that might go beyond the traditional sort of parameters of, strictly speaking, nuclear arms control. Because what constitutes strategic, the understanding of what constitutes strategic has changed. So they might have to broaden the scope of the discussions to include not only strategic nuclear systems, but also some of the conventional systems. And so I think how that progresses will have a key impact on how we emerge from this crisis. And in the meantime, other countries also have to grapple with the situation where the multilateral institutions found themselves in such precarious position when we had 4 years of the lack of interest on the part of the United States to play the leadership role. And so the task for many countries, sort of middle powers or semi-great powers, is to figure out what they can do to maintain those multilateral institutions, multilateralism writ large, to make it more sustainable and not so dependent on the policies of one key actor.
I think when we talk about the disarmament community and multilateral commitments and multilateral cooperation to meet goals, it's important to bring up the original goals of the disarmament community. So looking back to the NPT, we see these goals of achieving a general and complete disarmament, as well as the elimination of nuclear weapon stockpiles. And this is again brought up in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that just entered into force. Do you believe that we will ever reach these particular goals? And what do you think the next steps will be, or conversely should be, made towards these goals, given the difficult context that we are in at present by the arms control community writ large?
So the goal of general and complete disarmament emerged as an international aspiration in the wake of the World War II and in a way of World War I. So having gone through 2 horrendous wars in the space of less than 40 years, humanity certainly came to this idea that we need to possibly abolish war altogether and using war as instrument of foreign policy. But it soon became clear, of course, that general and complete disarmament is a very big and complicated goal, and it's a big piece to chew on. And in the meantime, we had the advent of nuclear weapons and the emergence of the nuclear arms race. So very quickly, the nuclear weapons became a priority as the kinds of weapons that are capable of destroying life on Earth in fairly short order. So that's why when you look at Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the ultimate aspiration is general and complete disarmament, but the first steps there, the effective measures listed are towards the cessation of nuclear arms race and achieving nuclear disarmament. And so it's important to keep that in mind, at least in the NPT context. And that's how it's been really since then. We don't very often talk about practical steps to achieve general and complete disarmament as much as we talk about practical steps to achieve nuclear disarmament. And what the next practical steps must be in terms of achieving nuclear disarmament, well, that's part of the disagreement in a sense between the 2 trends that I mentioned before, because on the side that is very conscious of security situation, of the relations between US and Russia, and generally speaking, relations among nuclear arm possessors and how it affects prospects of nuclear disarmament, that side has traditionally and continues to emphasize a very gradual, step-by-step approach. Whereas the humanitarian disarmament movement, it started to look at the problem more holistically, more comprehensively. It's not that they imagine nuclear disarmament being achieved overnight, but they see it more as the need to shift our evaluation of nuclear weapons, our assessment of how legitimate those weapons are. And so ultimately, I think it's going to be the challenge to achieve that paradigm shift among states who currently rely on nuclear weapons, from nuclear weapons are guarantee of our security to nuclear weapons are not acceptable as an instrument of security. And how to get there is complicated because it's not just about it's not so much about little practical steps. It's really about finding that key to the perception among policymakers, among not just diplomats, but certainly policymakers and the general audience. But looking at the shorter period ahead of us, I think we do need to talk about reducing, once again, the salience of nuclear weapons, reducing their mission. And I'm glad to see that there is certainly a livelier conversation in the United States about the no first use policy or sole purpose statement, where the United States would declare that the only purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter an attack by nuclear weapons, or the United States would adopt a policy that they won't be the first they won't use nuclear weapons first. I think that would be a very, very good step towards reducing sort of the role of nuclear weapons in security concepts, not only for the United States, but also its allies that rely on extended nuclear deterrence, that sort of promise that the United States would come to their defense with all means necessary, which automatically includes nuclear weapons. So reducing the salience, the mission of nuclear weapons is an important step that needs to be taken fairly soon. Commitment to not only cap arsenals, but also reduce them numerically. And it's great that we have New START extended, but I think the next stage should also begin broadening the scope of what's covered by nuclear arms control, especially between the United States and Russia. And again, there they might have to look beyond the traditional sort of strategic nuclear systems to look at all kinds of nuclear systems that they have, and possibly include some of the conventional systems that affect each other's perception of strategic stability. So I think these are kind of the steps that really need to happen in a shorter term.
So you've brought up now several times the growing and influential humanitarian initiative, as well as the need for paradigm shift decentering deterrence, which is a concept that has sort of been reinforced during the recent pandemic, when we're being forced to have conversations on what constitutes state security in this sort of clear human security context, and what roles nuclear weapons play. How do we begin to push not only to the disarmament community, but the broader global community further towards this narrative? Do we do this within the traditional disarmament fora? Do we do this external to the disarmament fora? Do we do this as a grassroots movement in the way that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons did? Do we make an effort to broaden initiatives like the CTBTO Youth Group? How do you see us pushing this narrative and moving the global community towards this idea and the notion of the need for a paradigm shift that is clearly emerging amongst disarmament practitioners who see the trends and are aware of what needs to be changed in order to make progress?
I think the discussion certainly cannot be confined only to the so-called traditional disarmament negotiating fora. Half of them have been so stagnant that it's really questionable how useful that discussion would be. And I think one of the strengths of the humanitarian initiative was precisely that they definitely stepped outside the traditional disarmament arms control circles. They looked at survivors, they involved the survivors, they looked at the broader community and how nuclear weapons affect all of us, because that's the crux of the issue. It's not just it's not just a question for diplomats. It's not just a question for militaries. If used, nuclear weapons will have a tremendous impact on people around the world, including countries that had never considered having nuclear weapons, that really don't see themselves as part of this conversation, or had not traditionally seen themselves as playing an important part in this conversation. And so bringing the message home that there would be an impact on the countries far removed from the nuclear issues was very important for garnering this support and growing the movement. And I think that needs to continue. The conversation about what constitutes security, how do states provide security, what role is there for security, insecurity for nuclear weapons, that conversation needs to reach the broader audience. This is particularly important, of course, for democratic countries where the public has effective tools to pressure politicians to affect policy. But I think that would also eventually reach other states as well. And there's a role for youth organizations, certainly, and it's great to see growing in that the interest in the question has grown, and that youth, in many respects, has taken a different approach to the nuclear weapons issue than before. They don't see nuclear deterrence as a sacrosanct. They don't necessarily see nuclear weapons as this guarantor of security. They're willing and insist sometimes on asking difficult questions about what role do nuclear weapons really play and what risks they pose, and whether it's that trade-off is worth it. And another interesting initiative that might be worth mentioning is getting to the banks and financial institutions and questioning their role and their investments, how they pay attention or not where they invest, and whether the companies that they invest in have anything to do with nuclear weapons production. So the Don't Bank on the Bomb has been a very interesting campaign that I think has had impact already.
Shifting gears a little bit to speak about your experience in disarmament negotiations. It is one thing to be a student studying disarmament and imagine what negotiations are like, or take simulation courses and try and imagine what it is like to be present at these important international discussions on treaty or negotiations of treaty text. But I imagine it is a completely different experience to attend and play a role in the real processes. What was it like serving as an expert to a delegation during the NPT review process and at the TPNW negotiations? I imagine they're different experiences, but it would be fascinating to hear about both.
Real life negotiating fora are, of course, fascinating, especially for someone who studied the subject. But they can also be a much more frustrating experience than a simulation that takes place in an academic environment, because of course those fora, those environments are political. It's first and foremost a political process, whereas when you are engaged in a simulation as a student, by and large the focus is on substantive issues. When you're studying for a non-proliferation degree, of course you emphasize all the things you learn about policy, about the weapons themselves, etc. You hone your negotiating skills. Being in the real life negotiating environment can feel much more of a slog, but that's kind of the beauty of it. That's the real life experience of it. I was never part of the super exclusive sort of the closed door negotiations. That's reserved for really a handful of countries. But just being in rooms where at least some of the paragraphs of the text are being hammered out, and then you see how it's actually done, and how it's not necessarily substance that wins in the end. It's the negotiating skill of one side or the other. It's who brings to bear what kind of weight of an ambassador, as opposed to as for a secretary at the table. It's a lot of different games, a lot of them procedural in nature, that really play an important part in how the negotiation shapes. Personalities are very, very important. So you really get to not only sort of remember the substance of it that you learned and apply and try to provide advice to the delegation that you're serving, but it's also observing how all these other factors can shape the outcome. But being a so-called expert on the delegation, of course, your first and foremost job is to provide substantive advice. You look at the text, a draft text, you look at statements, you make suggestions, comments on this and that. Some of them are taken, some of them not. Again, could be for political reasons, because there's a certain position that a country has, and you could be objectively right from the sort of dispassionate non-proliferation perspective, but there are other considerations that states and diplomats have to keep in mind, and so they may not accept your advice for those reasons. But it's taken together, it's a fascinating experience.
And how did the experience at the NPT review conferences differ from the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? given that that's such a monumental piece of international legislation that has happened in the last several years, and is something that I have been watching fairly excitedly the entire time. I would love to hear what that was like different from the NPT review conference process.
The negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons had a very different dynamic to it compared to either of the review conferences that I attended. RevCons are part of an established process. The review conferences take place every 5 years, and they have since 1975. There is certain script to it, a certain sequence of steps, and of course, it could be successful, it could be not so successful. We can get stuck on procedural issues or on substantive issues, but this sort of feel of an established thing to it. Whereas the negotiation of the new treaty was a new setup, and there was that overwhelming sense of urgency. And you could feel that states really wanted to get it done. I think there was some perception that the opportunity would go away if they don't finish the negotiations in that 1 year in 2017. And so there was a lot of will on the part of diplomats to achieve an outcome, to work through the difficulties. It might have resulted in a document that's not as great as many have hoped, but again, a lot of times how negotiations go depends on the atmospherics of it, of the dynamic of the process itself. And what also was different is this atmosphere, because there were no nuclear weapon states there. It felt like a different conversation, because when nuclear weapon states are in the room, they certainly dominate the conversation about nuclear weapons, and it becomes about security, about their concept and perception of security and stability. And then the non-nuclear weapon states almost default to this position of reminding what all the nuclear weapon states promised to do, what they have to do. There's a fair share of playing game, or used to be a bit of a trying to persuade that yes, you really have to implement those steps, but it really all rotates around nuclear weapon states and their policies. Whereas when we came to the TPNW negotiations, nuclear possessors were not there, and that first week in March, where states were discussing just their general vision and priorities for the treaty, the conversation was about the weapons themselves, and partly their impact, and then what needs to go into the treaty. So it was just a very kind of different atmosphere and dynamic throughout that first week and the rest of the negotiation.
It's fascinating to hear the contrast there, the sort of traditional statements versus removing the states that appear to have resulted in a stagnation of development and innovation in disarmament and progress towards our cumulative goals, resulted in the production of this treaty that, I mean, well, perhaps no treaty text is perfect, is monumental and has now entered into force. Another thing sort of on the subject of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the NPT that I would love to address is having your experience at the NPT and as a scholar studying the review process and having attended and reviewed a conference that was successful and a less successful conference, to say the least. How do you expect the 2020 review conference to proceed when it eventually convenes, be it in August or later? And how do you imagine the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons will influence these discussions? I know that mentions of it had previously been seen as somewhat controversial by the states that are not exactly proponents of the TPNW. So I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on that.
I should probably start by mentioning that the disagreement on the need for a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons or a legally binding instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons was quite central to the nuclear disarmament debate at the 2015 NPT Review Conference. It basically was the most polarizing, most divisive issue. And now we have that instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons. And so understandably, experts, diplomats have been asking question, what does it mean now for the next review conference? Is that going to be the central disagreement again? How do we account for the fact that we do now have a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons? So it's certainly a concern going into the next review conference, but I don't think that it has to be really central, because in 2015 that was the central of the argument. Should there be a new instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons? Well, now we have it. It's in force. So it's really not a productive use of time to relitigate the issue. We can't undo it, much as some states might want to. So it's there. It's a fact of life. It's part of the international law now. And then I think it's significant that the TPNW supporters themselves, some of the states who were leading the negotiations, they have signaled that they don't want the subject to be central to the next review conference, and they are more interested in focusing the discussion on the status and implementation of actions and steps agreed by previous review conferences. So they want the NPT REFCON discussions to really focus about NPT past commitments, and it certainly makes sense, and I think it's an opportunity for the two sides of the TPNW debate to engage more constructively with each other. They would still need to find a way to account for the treaty's existence, given the disagreements. So we won't get a full-on endorsement of the treaty, but it's also unrealistic to think that we would have a final document with no reference to the treaty. But I think this is where the diplomatic skill comes in, and ultimately it's about political will on both sides to have some kind of a compromise on that language. I think that would only be possible if there is something else substantive on the table to discuss, and that would be the implementation of past commitments, and especially taking them forward. And this is where I think the nuclear weapon states have an important leadership role to play, and come in with identification of priorities, what they see as the steps that they would focus on implementing in the next 5 or 10 years. And that would be something, I think, constructive and productive to discuss at the next review conference. Whether they're able to do that or even willing to do that, that of course is a separate question, it's a different question. And in large part, that would depend, I think, on the progress of the arms control discussions between the United States and Russia, and also, in a sense, between the United States and China. Because in the past several years, US has been more vocal about the need to involve China somehow in arms control. Previous US administration didn't offer any clarity on what they mean by that. The new administration, Biden administration, might try to engage China in arms control discussions. And I think that those processes will affect what they can bring to the table, to what extent nuclear weapon states themselves can agree on the priority steps in nuclear disarmament and arms control for the next review cycle. I think I see that issue as really central to defining how the review conference goes, whenever it happens to convene.
Something else that I think would be useful for us to address here for people that are interested in the disarmament field is the common observation of the security field, that it is male dominated, that it feels like somewhat of a boys' club. In talking about disarmament as a potential career path, I think it would be useful for people to hear a discussion of the role that women play and that women have been playing in the disarmament community, in particular in the last several years. Would you mind discussing a little bit how you see women represented in disarmament, and perhaps address how we can encourage young women to continue entering into the field?
Yeah, security field and nuclear field in particular have been notorious as not just boys' club, but old men club. And that I think has certainly over the years, over the decades, affected the conversation and approaches to the value involved in nuclear weapons and what's possible and what's acceptable in terms of discussing nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. But we've seen change recently. It's been welcome and hopeful. It's not quite enough, but it's a good start. Both in terms of the representation of women on delegations, but also their leadership roles, and the very fact that we actually talk about this in the context of NPT meetings and other meetings. The question of gender and nuclear weapons and gender and disarmament is certainly gained in prominence and is not something just for women to discuss. It's an issue that's being brought up across the board. And we went from that being sort of a non-topic at all in the NPT discussions when I started out, sort of 2009, 2010, to having side events, multiple side events during NPT review process meetings, speaking about women in nuclear weapons, women in disarmament diplomacy. The humanitarian initiative was interesting in this regard because they not only spoke about representation as such, but actually about the different impact of radiation on women and girls. So bring that kind of aspect into it. And I think that's been pointed out before. If you look at even just the composition of delegations or some pictures from the negotiations of the TPNW, you see a lot more women being very prominent. Where some of the very important delegations were led by women. The negotiations themselves were presided over by a woman ambassador. I think that certainly didn't go unnoticed, but it wasn't something predetermined and designed. It just so happened. But I'm glad to see that there's also a conversation about not there just being a woman on the delegation, but what kind of role those women play if they are at the forefront, delivering statements, influencing the positions, engaging actively in negotiations rather than taking notes, as the role we see in some delegations, where if they do happen to bring a woman, they tend to sort of give her the back seat virtually. So it's not enough to simply have women on delegations, but also have women empowered to represent and to negotiate. And I think we've seen some progress in that. And I think it's been also important that it's been approached as a subject to study. We'll just talk about the UNIDIR, for example, produced several studies looking at the representation of women in different disarmament fora, and raising some important questions about why this is happening and what should change. And so I think that's one area where things are improving, maybe not fast enough, but they've started moving in the right direction.
We're coming towards the end of our time here. So I thought just to wrap up, we might delve a little bit into your experiences as a student at MIIS. What was the most useful, influential, or beneficial thing that you did as a student at MIIS that has helped you in your career since then? Do you have any advice for recent or soon-to-be grads or people just interested in the field of disarmament? And what opportunities or perspectives have come to your attention that you think that young people should be studying or should be brought to our attention?
As I said, I started out as an absolute beginner in the field. I didn't have previous experience or background or knowledge, except that I knew, of course, that Kazakhstan was the home to the largest nuclear weapons test site. And so during the Soviet times, hundreds of nuclear weapons tests were carried out at the Semipalatinsk test site, and that has had a tremendous negative impact on local population and the environment. So that I knew that, and then remembered that it's kind of this almost a national identity forming experience, phenomenon where the first truly public movement in Kazakhstan was to push for the closure of the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site in the late 80s, early 90s. And going into the studies, other than reading everything in sight, and trying to take every possible course that the credits could allow, I also was very anxious to become a graduate research assistant at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. And I think that was very important for adding a bit of a practical perspective and experience to the academic studies. I think to the extent that it's possible, non-proliferation students should try to get a position with CNS where they can get involved in some research projects and work more closely with some of the professors that can help them identify a specialization within the field. For some students going in, they either already have an interest beforehand, or for some, interest is defined by their language and regional studies, but that shouldn't stop them from looking at also other possible topics that could be surprising discoveries that they want that they will find themselves interested in terms of the areas within the non-proliferation field. Another important experience was certainly doing the IONP internship. And that's also something I knew from the beginning that I wanted to do. I took a semester off to do the IONP internship at the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs in New York. I think that has had a tremendous impact on me. I now work on multilateral issues on the NPT, on the United Nations. Clearly that has had an effect on me. And I think it's a great opportunity even for those who don't think that, who may come out of it thinking, I will never want to work for the United Nations, but they will at least come out with an informed decision, having seen what it's like. So I think it's an important, it's important to have an internship, and if you can get an IONP internship, I think it's a great opportunity. In terms of academics, a career-defining course for me was a seminar with Bill Potter on proliferation trends and trigger events. It was the first seminar on the subject that he offered, and it was a part of a research project basically that had started shortly before that. And I got so involved in the topic that I found myself working on the project beyond that course. And ended up being hired by CNS to continue working on that, and ended up co-editing the 2 volumes on proliferation forecasting. And I've stayed with CNS in one capacity or another since then. And that course was, as I said, it was brand new. I had no idea what to expect. I couldn't ask previous students. But it was really one of the most interesting courses I took, and the most influential in terms of my subsequent career. In terms of opportunities for young people, as I said, internships are important. I'm also glad to see a push for having paid internships. The UN is not quite there yet, but at least other organizations and think tanks, so that's a good development. It's certainly important. There were certain difficulties associated with having an unpaid internship with the UN. So internships are important. Trying to get practical experience while at CNS as a research assistant is important. But beyond that, I think there's so many opportunities now for the young people to get their voices out, that I think they should certainly take advantage of that. And I have seen people do it. A lot of the op-eds or blog posts or Twitter threads, a lot of them are done by really young people in the field. And that's something that wasn't necessarily around when I started out, right? That Facebook was kind of a baby thing then, and Twitter didn't really exist, or certainly wasn't seen yet as a professional tool. It was kind of like for celebrities to post what they had for breakfast. But now Twitter is certainly a professional field for me. The only reason I go on Twitter is really for nuclear stuff. And I think in a sense, it's an equalizing field as well, because young people can post on different online platforms, get their voices heard. and that helps diversify the conversation and the field. And one of the great things and trends I think I've observed is looking at how younger people getting into the field approach the very subject of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, and to see that they don't necessarily accept this received wisdom that nuclear weapons have kept us all safe and will continue to do so. They actively question all those tenets of nuclear deterrence and whether we need the nuclear triad in the United States, etc. I'm really glad to see that they're not afraid to pose those questions and pose them publicly and get that view out there. And I think that's a very hopeful sign that the conversation around nuclear weapons and their role and their value is changing.
All right, well, thank you so much for sharing your opinions, your perspective, your insight with us today. It has been so lovely to speak with you, and I think that your contributions to this program will be very helpful to new and prospective students, whether at MIIS or just at the Middlebury community in general. So thank you so much, and we will see you for another episode of the MIDDVantage Exploring Careers in Global Security series later. Thank you.